please welcome Sarah, Sala, and Edward Hirsch. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much, Danielle. Thank you to Center for Fiction. Thank you to Ed Hirsch, who I met 13 years ago in my first semester of the Poetry MFA at NYU. So I did that math today, and I was like, that's amazing.
We were just girls then.
That's right, we were. What did I know then? So it feels really beautiful to come full circle and to be on the same stage with a very beloved professor and poet and someone who is a true advocate for getting poetry out there. So I was thinking maybe we could start with a poem, even before we start talking here. Maybe Amy Lowell's poem, Madonna of the Evening Flowers. Would that be okay if I read that one?
Sounds great.
Awesome.
Hey, by the way, did you hear that they're renaming the Center for Poetry?
That's right. There's a rumor.
Yeah, there's a rumor that it's going to change. They're going to be shocked on Monday morning.
That's right.
When they see the sign outside that we've changed the name to the Center for Poetry.
Poets are subversive, once you let us in the door. All right. Madonna of the Evening Flowers. All day long, I have been working. Now I am tired. I call, where are you? But there is only the oak tree rustling in the wind. The house is very quiet. The sun shines in on your books, on your scissors and thimble just put down. But you are not there. Suddenly, I'm lonely. Where are you? I go about searching. Then I see you, standing under a spire of pale blue larkspur, with a basket of roses on your arm. You are cool, like silver, and you smile. I think the Canterbury bells are playing little tunes. You tell me that the peonies need spraying, that the columbines have overrun all bounds, that the Pyrus japonica should be cut back and rounded. You tell me these things, but I look at you, heart of silver, white heart flame of polished silver, burning beneath the blue steeples of the larkspur. And I long to kneel instantly at your feet, while all about us peal the loud, sweet Te Deums of the Canterbury bells. Woo!
It's hot.
It is. Right? I was like, let's start out with some hotness for tonight. So yeah, I was really struck by, in the essay about her work when you wrote, I was excited by my discoveries and learned a crucial lesson too, which was not to take the evaluations of the canon for granted. It's filled with prejudices and blind spots, inherited ideas, received opinions, trendy thinking, right? And you ended with, it's better to read widely and figure things out for yourself. So yeah, do you want to say anything about this Amy Lowell poem, about how one puts together an anthology?
Well, I have a lot to say about the whole book, but let's start with Amy Lowell,
Yes,
since you started
please.
with Amy Lowell.
Yeah.
Those of you, for example, who are old enough to remember that you probably remember that Amy Lowell was not part of our reading list. Mm-hmm. That if she came on, she was condescended to by Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot. Ezra Pound didn't like what she did with imagism and called it Amygism. And this was a sort of an insult to her that was sort of carried on. And then she herself was a kind of a big bellicose person who was a sort of a barker for the new poetry. And so if you looked at the anthologies when I was coming up, you'd think that Amy Lowell was a minor figure who kind of was a kind of footnote to the larger thing. There was usually maybe one poem by hers, usually patterns in the anthology. But then when you start looking at her actual work, the gap between the way Amy Lowell actually wrote and Amy Lowell's reputation is quite great. And that it turns out that Amy Lowell was a tremendously passionate, quiet poet of same-sex love. and was written out of the canon for all kinds of reasons. There's a lot of fat shaming. There's a lot of anti-lesbian sentiment. It was all wink, wink. It was all, she just left out. Then you start reading the poems, you go, hold it a second.
Yeah.
I mean, that poem you read, that's a sexy poem.
Yeah.
And that's like, but what's more is like, this is like, to me, this is a modern poem that's almost out of the Song of Songs. It's got that same feeling. But it's also got, I mean, I think it's a little funny. And the funniness, or to what I consider the humor, is there's the poet, speaker, and her kind of anxiety. She's not hiding the fact that she's a writer. She suddenly gets lonely and she starts looking for her beloved. And her beloved comes in, but she's a gardener, right? So she's like literally like she's got the actual flowers. And she wants to talk about the flowers, but Amy Lowell's like, no. The speaker for Amy Lowell is like this position of, really it's the position of the troubadour who is traditionally prostrating himself before the feet of the great beloved. And so her beloved is a muse figure. But she's also a real person who's come in and working in the garden, and she like wants to tell her about the garden, but no, she wants to fall on her knees basically before her. And then what Amy Lowell picks up on this, and what she hears is this religious intonation in the names of the flowers. And that's where you get Madonna of the Evening Flowers. And so she gets this, and then she ends it. You can almost hear her catching it, the Canterbury. What's the line? The Canterbury?
Well, all about us peal the loud, sweet Tadoms of the Canterbury bells.
It's like religious devotion. This is right out of the Song of Songs. This is right out of that. But she's inverted it because it's like, I mean, she's way ahead of Adrienne Rich and using this for kind of towards the beloved. It's extremely radical to write this poem in the 1920s to another woman. But also she's using this religious imagery, which you get from the Song of Songs, which is the language of devotion applied to the language of love, which has been a traditional trope of European poetry and then carried over into American poetry of the beloved declares her or his beloved is a religious sacrament, as if it's devotion to God. There's a lot of contortions in the criticism about the Hebrew Bible to try and prove that this is not about an actual person, but really of love poems to God. But you really got to twist yourself up to see the Song of Songs that way.
Yeah.
So this is, in my opinion, a radically new kind of poem in a plain style, but uses a long history of religious imagery related to love and picks up the troubadour tradition of the singer singing her beloved, but instead of it being his beloved, it's her beloved to her beloved. And when you just look, so I had to just pick one poem, but this is all over Amy Lowell's work, these poems. And it's just like, so this is where I got the idea that I'm arguing, like, well, if you just listen to, say, the modernists that I was reading, like Hugh Kenner and his tremendous book, The Pound Era, which I really love, or his book about American poetry, which I was also crazy about, you go, well, hold it a second. She's just been dismissed. And for decades and decades and decades, until really I'm not the first one to discover this, other feminist critics began to discover Amy Lowell and say, what is this actually like? But I mean, they're mainly looking at it from a somewhat, I would say, forgive me, polemical point of view. I go, let's just try and see what happens if we look at it, take this all into account and write about it as poetry. And she's also, what really would have enraged Ezra Pound is she also got interested in Chinese poetry, mainly through him, partially in competition with him, and is using some of that element of the single image that you get in Chinese poetry for her own poems. So I just think this poem really, she deserves another look. She deserves another rereading, and that I can make the case. And it's not a political case, although there's a politics behind it. I can make the case based on this poem that you've just heard, which is just, to me, just really a heated, intense, passionate poem that moves from the quotidian, I'm working at my desk, and it's got this tone of anxiety, and ends up with her kneeling before the beloved. I mean, you're in like 25 lines, you've moved a tremendous difference to the liftoff.
Absolutely. And there's so much energy in it too. Wonderful. I was thinking as you were speaking, that it's so lucky as a reader for us to be able to have you kind of over our shoulder talking about these poems so passionately as well. And it's so well researched too. One of the things I was going to ask you is like, how did you research into their backgrounds? Because it feels so inevitable when this information comes, and yet there's so much in this book that I, as a student of poetry, never knew about.
Thank you for saying so. Don't be mad at me, because for what I'm about to say. But if you know from the introduction, I wrote this book without my books, because it was during the pandemic. I mean, I had this commission to write a book for the Library of America, about 40 American poems to coincide with the anniversary of the library. And I thought the hard task, which we'll come to, would be choosing which poems.
Right.
Because you can't have the same canon that you had in 1950. But if you put in Amy Lowell and you have only 40 poems, you got to drop Edgar Allan Poe. I mean, it's just like, there's just numbers here.
Right.
And so I thought that was going to be the hard decision. But then during the pandemic, I moved down to Atlanta to be with my partner. My books are in my office in Manhattan because I don't have an apartment big enough to hold my poetry library. And so I had to write this book without my library. And at first I was very, very distraught about it. And then I believe it helped me because it forced me to think for myself. And that's part of how I got to those lines. Like, instead of thinking about what you already knew, you just think, instead of looking up what Helen Vendler says or Hugh Kenner says or what all the critics say, we go, what do you actually think? Like, what do you think about this poet? What do you think about this poem? What do you think about these lines? What do you think about this stanza? I mean, I just forced myself over and over again to decide what did I actually think after a lifetime in poetry. I mean, I'm bringing a lot to it. I had already had my feelings about Amy Lowell and about Ezra Pound and his insults to her. I was reading through the Dial when I was in college, and I found all these insults to American literature by Ezra Pound. And Amy Lowell was one of the people, and it sort of made me alert to like, well, maybe there's something in here because I don't like Ezra Pound, and so maybe I'm gonna go and like see what I can do, see what I can. So I had this already on Amy Lowell. I didn't just discover this during the pandemic, but I had to choose which poem, and what I thought of it and how I wanted to make the case for her inclusion.
That's really wonderful. I love, like, we're continuing with the subversive poets theme. It was like a gauntlet that Ezra threw down that you picked up. I love it.
The idea, though, your idea was not just to present the poem, but to take you through, well, first of all, because every poem was a representative for me, because it was one of 40, it was a chance to, one, introduce the poet. And as you know, this book is a kind of education in poetry, so I leave a lot of my errors in, like what I first thought about a poet and then how I got schooled. Because I first had this idea that I got from Eliot and Pound, and then I started thinking, well, what is this? And then I started rethinking it. So it's my first exposure, because I was on my own. I'm just remembering what happened when I first read this poet, and what did I think? And what do I think now? And is it the same or is it changed? Often it's changed. And how did I get to the new place? And then what do I think about this poet? And then I drill down on what do I think about this poem? And then the essay. And the idea is really that the poem stands right at the beginning. You can just read that if you want. But in all my work, I try to be a guide, stand in not for the poet, but for the reader, to take you further into the history of poetry and how this poem relates to it and what you might see in it that you might not see on your own. And then it's up to you. But my idea is to like act as the reader of one reader responding to this, and then you don't have to take my interpretation or not, but I'm gonna just present you with what it is. So that's the structure of how it works.
And I really appreciate that structure too, because poetry can be intimidating. Poetry can seem like a closed room sometimes if we're not sure how to open the door or crawl through the window, right? So I guess if someone is new to poetry and wants to get into poetry more often, what might you say to them to remove that intimidation or, help them become readers who enjoy poetry more?
I would say to them, how to read a poem and fall in love with poetry, which is the book I wrote to try and answer that question. Like, how do you speak to an initiated and an uninitiated reader? When I was working for Double Take magazine, they did a little brochure called How to Read a Poem, and this was the key to, we had stumbled on something towards a larger audience, because they had me do 10 things. Like, the first one was like, turn off the television set. Like, you can't, if you have the TVs on, you're not gonna be able to read poetry. Like, get a good light, like that. Relax, then, like that. And they just couldn't keep the brochure in print. I mean, people were responding to it. There's so many people who, I believe, you can't single out poetry because the American educational system is so bad. But one of the disasters and casualties has often been poetry, because teachers don't like poetry and they don't know how to teach it, and they have a bad feeling, and they punish you. If you go into a second grade class, kids like poetry. You go into a sixth or seventh grade class, they don't like it anymore. Something happened. So the first thing literally is relax. The second thing is bring people poems that you like, that you actually care about. That not just because of the meter, or not, the way we were taught it was like, a sonnet is 14 lines. There's a Petrarchan sonnet, a Shakespearean sonnet, yawn. There'll be a quiz on it. No one ever explained why you would want to write a Petrarchan sonnet or why you would want to write a Shakespearean sonnet. And I have a lot to say about that. Because the sonnet was invented in Sicily in the 12th century by a bunch of notaries. And they were legal minds, and they came up with a kind of legal structural form. But what they hit upon was that they could turn this legal mind to erotic love as a subject. So you have these legal minds trying to think about erotic love. Well, no wonder you have sonnet sequences. You can't just get to the bottom of this right away. It turns out it's an inexhaustible subject. It just keeps overrunning the logic, because love is not logical. And you just keep having this happen again and again with Dante, with Petrarch, and so on. I don't want to go into a history of the sonnet, but we weren't taught the sonnet like that. Right. We were taught it was just this form. So I think you begin with the poems, and then when you try and explain the poem or talk through the poem, then you immediately get to the sonnet form, then you immediately get to the structure and how the structure works, and then you begin to see how the structure works and how the poem is a kind of delivery system for the emotion and the feeling and the thinking.
Absolutely, yeah. I think that context is essential. Like you said, starting with poems that you love and adore, or maybe have memorized, right? Or have on your fridge. When I first started dating my spouse, we had the same poem on our fridge. I was like, that's a thumbs up. I think we can do this.
I'm gonna marry you.
Yeah, exactly. Our
yeah.
poems align. We can do this.
Yeah.
One of the other things I was going to ask you, and I'm just going to name some of the poets who are in this anthology too, to bring them into the space with us. So the Heart of American Poetry contains poems and essays from you on the likes of Phillis Wheatley, Emma Lazarus, Walt Whitman, Langston Hughes, Emily Dickinson, Sterling A. Brown, who's a musician, Julia de Burgos, Wallace Stevens, Garrett Hongo, Frank O'Hara, Joy Harjo, and so many more. I won't list all 40 of them. But I'm curious, did writing this book feel like a tour of your own influences? I know you said you were writing this in the pandemic away from your library. Or did you go out of your way to loop in poets that you hadn't spent much time with, too?
I can't say that because I was writing without my library, I can't say that I was I wasn't writing about any poets that I hadn't spent a lot of time with. But I wasn't just choosing my favorite poets. That's not what this book is. I'm not just saying these are 40 my favorite American poems that I love the most by my favorite 40 poets. I'm trying to represent.
Of course.
And because this is the whole history of American poetry. So everything is sort of making a case, making an argument. And so who's the poet? What's the poem? What's the case? It's not just my favorite. It's not just my favorites. On the other hand, I mean, when you write about something, you do discover things about it that you didn't know. That's certainly the case. But I wasn't like, it wasn't like I'd never heard of Garrett Hongo, or I'd never heard of Julia de Burgos, or I hadn't heard of Sterling Brown or Robert Johnson. It wasn't, I can't say it was that. Sure. I wasn't discovering these poets for the first time. I was selecting poets who'd been meaningful to me in terms of making this larger case for, behind this is a premise, what is American poetry? Mm-hmm. Who belongs to American poetry? What is American poetry? What's our contribution to world literature on the poetry sphere? And I found that there isn't much hard thinking about this. I mean, there are loyalists, but there's not much thinking, serious consideration about what the poetry of democracy is and why it matters, which is our project. And of course, I don't think I would have written this if it wasn't during the pandemic and everything wasn't happening. I mean, I was going to think about the project of American poetry, but there's no question in my mind that the effect of what I now think of as a sustained authoritarian threat to democracy pushed me harder to think about what my people have to say about this, what poets have to say about this, and what is the project of American poetry, and how does it affect, how is democracy part of this? Because I suddenly saw, in a way that many of us saw, that democracy was under siege in a way that I had never seen it before. I mean, I'd had a lot of presidents that I hated, a lot that I'd felt really alienated by. I thought Richard Nixon was about the worst president we could have. He seems like a king by comparison now. But anyway, I won't go into that. But I will go into the fact that I tried to contribute by thinking about what the poetry of democracy is. And there is, in my opinion, an egalitarian promise at the basis of this, that all persons are created equal. And that because we're a country of broken promises, poets keep holding themselves and other poets to the standard. They hold others' feet to the fire. And I got the idea that American poetry, because I can't deal with all of American culture, but American poetry as part of American culture is an underutilized resource. And the contribution is a continual rethinking and reevaluation of the values of American poetry. And the idea behind this is that American poetry is actually a kind of family, sometimes a dysfunctional family. Sometimes a lot of people are in the family that other people in the family don't like. I got this idea, I was telling my sister, sometimes it's like a meal at a holiday where people go storming off in different directions. She goes, yeah, I wonder where you got that idea. It's like, and the way I got this idea was I was writing about, is it okay to talk about this?
Absolutely,
yeah, okay.
Please.
I was writing about, in the introduction, Walt Whitman's poem, I Hear America Singing. And it occurred to me that no one had ever stood at street level like that before. I mean, Wordsworth had done something, but Whitman really stood at street level and wrote about ordinary working people. Now, in that poem, he's writing about carpenters, he's writing about janitors, he does eventually remember women like housewives sewing. It takes him a little while to get there, but he does include it. Everyone's represented by their work. America Singing is everyone contributing to this ideal. But there's a promise there, is everyone included? In the 1920s, Langston Hughes came along. He was down and out in Genoa, and he writes a poem, I Too Sing America. Now, interestingly, I had taught this poem a few years ago to these, every year I teach these national student poets a kind of class in poetry together. They're just incredibly talented, but they don't know actually much about poetry. And they all knew the Langston Hughes poem, but they did not know that it had anything to do with Walt Whitman. But it's because it was just taught to them as an anthology poem, a great poem by Langston Hughes. I too sing America. But like, I hear America singing, I too sing America. And then the thing that gave me this idea was he says, I am the darker brother. He doesn't say, I am the enemy. He doesn't say, I'm not your friend. He goes, I'm your darker brother. And then he goes, you're gonna have to invite me to the table. I'm gonna have to sit there. So the idea is that there's a premise in Whitman, but it was Jim Crow America ruled out certain people. Langston Hughes come along and said, well, I too sing America, and then he transforms it in this remarkable way to become, I too am America. But he also goes, I am the darker brother. And this gave me the idea that this is a family. And you get into the family by eloquence. You're not born into the family. You're not born, it's not a tribe like that, as in certain countries where certain poets are born, families pass on the legacy. It's a kind of tribal thing. It's not like that. You get it, you earn your way in. You write your way in through literary eloquence. And that Langston Hughes was doing that. And he was also holding America to another kind of ideal. And so my idea is that American poetry is continually revising itself by a process of inclusion, and that's inclusion in all kinds of ways, to enlarge the canon based on the principle, which is the American principle of all people are created equal. And then I found this kind of dialogue or argument going on between the individual and the collective, between individualism, which is an American phenomena, and the larger collective. And what I found is that, I just found out, I was just thinking about it actually. So you think about all the things that Ralph Waldo Emerson is one of my guides as a kind of declaration of independence for an American poetry separated from Europe poetry. And then I started thinking about, well, what does Emerson say in Nature? Why should not we also enjoy an original relation to the universe? You go, hold it a second. He doesn't say, why do not I also enjoy an original relation? Why should not we have a religion of innovation rather than of tradition? You go, well, hold it a second. Time and again, Ralph Waldo Emerson, who's this great poet of self-reliance, keeps saying we. So you go, well, what is that? And so I find in this kind of American conversation, time and again, the great poets of self-invention, like Walt Whitman saying, oneself I sing, a single separate person, yet utter the word democratic, the word en masse. I mean, as soon as he says, I'm a single separate person, he starts saying, well, what about the community? What about en masse, which means literally in a mass? So this kind of conversation, this is at the heart of American poetry. And it works in unlikely ways. So you think of someone like, say, one of our very greatest poets ever, Emily Dickinson. Mm-hmm. You think Emily Dickinson is just working on her own, writing her own poems of salvation. No. Emily Dickinson is taking the communal hymn structure, which is a collective form, and rupturing it, radically changing it, and revising it. But she uses 4/3 over and over and over again. She's not writing like free verse out of nowhere. She's taking the common hymn, and which carries with it certain values, which are communal values, which have to do with the values of collective salvation. And she seems to me making a case, an argument against that collective salvation, using the hymn form to reinvent poetry, to say, no, the most important thing is my individual salvation. And she keeps calling things like eternity my flood subject. But she takes it personally. So to me, Emily Dickinson is making way for the individual case within the larger collective. But it's a kind of argument or discussion, not by itself, but in relationship to a very great tradition, which is the hymn tradition. So again and again, I see this kind of conversation working out or played out between the individual self and the larger collective, and how we try and make space. And I say, in 100 different ways, if, as Emerson says, life is an ecstasy, then it has to be an ecstasy for all.
I'm really glad that you talked about how this book was birthed during the pandemic, during all of that unrest, because it feels like sometimes people like to say poetry is decorative. We can put it up on the shelf, But to me, poetry is urgent. It's essential. I can't live without it, too. So I don't know, do you want to say anything more about the role of poets in this world as living poets, who are, like you're saying, trying to make this case for equality, for social justice?
Neruda says poetry is like bread. This idea of poetry being decorous is sort of comes from people who don't like poetry. the idea that poetry is ornamental and therefore easily dispensed with, just as a kind of, I mean, I don't believe that everyone can't live without poetry. There are people who can live fine with other kinds of things. I mean, if you need something, but maybe your thing is something else. It doesn't have to be poetry. But I think that the poetry is urgent speech. And it's not decorous, it's not cerebral, it's not removed from life, it's covered with blood, it's written out of experience. And criticism is the same. And I mean, when I grew up, the idea was the critic was just standing above the text and looking down, and there was no relationship between the critic and the text. But I'm there all the time as a reader, as a subjective presence, taking you through it, making the case, making my argument, making it part of my education. I'm not pretending that I'm a dispassionate person just without any values or ideas. I'm finding what I can in these poems. I'm trying to speak about them as forthrightly and as fully as possible. I'm not just making stuff up about them in terms of the history of poetry and the genre of poetry, but I am trying hard to say that this book is being written by a person, just the way these poems are written by people. And this is a crucial thing. When we were growing up, the poems were treated as if they were written by the anthology. Like, I didn't know there was like a difference between a weird guy named Wordsworth and another weird guy named Coleridge. And the anthologies, and this is really true for American poetry, the anthologies flatten out the poets. I believe they normalize them, because we have a big investment in this optimistic idea of America. And whenever we sort of normalize a poet like Dickinson or Whitman or Robert Frost, and we take out their weirdness, their darkness, their doubts, we make a story that's more palatable for us as a kind of optimistic country. But there's always been a larger, darker shadow, a trauma that's underlined American poetry from the beginning with the idea that manifest destiny, one people's manifest destiny is another people's genocide. And that I'm arguing that when I was growing up, American poetry was treated as if there was only one stream historically, and that was Puritanism. And that this was the Puritan code. And the first poet I read about is Anne Bradstreet, who, by the way, I think is a marvelous underrepresented poet. And the second poet is Phillis Wheatley, who was an enslaved person. I believe there are three strong streams going into the history of American poetry, not just the Puritan code, although that's one of them. I mean, Anne Bradstreet was going to be an English coterie poet, but they lugged her to Massachusetts, and she was had to open the pantry to a very rough place that she wasn't prepared for. But there was indigenous peoples here for tens of thousands of years, possibly going back to the Paleolithic, and that history goes into American culture and American poetry too. The oral songs and chants of tribal peoples is at the core, the root of one of the sources of American poetry. The other thing I would say is when white slavers began to take Africans and bring them to the New World and enslave people, they certainly weren't thinking that they were going to change the culture of that new people and of that country, that new country. But that's certainly what happened. And that a new people, starting out as Africans, became African Americans and brought African culture to the country, and that the work that they did in fields, field hollers, shouts, our hoolies, have a call and response pattern that later transformed into the spiritual and the blues, and that became part of American art, music, and culture. And it carried over, but it wasn't the same level it wasn't just exactly African art. In a terrific book, who was then Leroy Jones, Amira Baraka wrote a book in 1963 called Blues People, and he argued that the blues uses the call and response pattern of African field calls, except there's a level of individualism in the blues that's not there in African folklore. that the blues incorporates the call and response pattern into a single person with singing and with a refrain, but he's singing of his own sorrows, his own losses, his own griefs, and that's a level of individualism that you find in American art that you don't find in African art. I found that tremendously convincing. And that's how I read Robert Johnson as part of this tradition, and I'm claiming him and this blues tradition as part of American poetry. I don't see why this blues tradition, which is so strong, which is a musical tradition, is also very related to American poetry. And you can read these songs also as poems.
Wow. This is a small taste of what it's like to read the book on the page. It's like this amazing passion that's coming through, and all of this knowledge just like pouring out. Ooh, it's great. We were talking about indigenous poetry. Should we go to Joy Harjo's poem? Does that sound okay?
Great idea.
Awesome. All right, so Joy Harjo is the last poet who you profile in the book. And this poem is called Rabbit is Up to Tricks. In a world long before this one, there was enough for everyone until somebody got out of line. We heard it was Rabbit fooling around with clay and the wind. Everybody was tired of his tricks and no one would play with him. He was lonely in this world. So Rabbit thought to make a person. And when he blew into the mouth of that crude figure to see what would happen, the clay man stood up. Rabbit showed the clay man how to steal a chicken. The clay man obeyed. Then Rabbit showed him how to steal corn. The clay man obeyed. Then he showed him how to steal someone else's wife. The clay man obeyed. Rabbit felt important and powerful. The clay man felt important and powerful. And once that clay man started, he could not stop. Once he took that chicken, he wanted all the chickens. And once he took that corn, he wanted all the corn. And once he took that wife, he wanted all the wives. He was insatiable. Then he had a taste of gold, and he wanted all the gold. Then it was land and anything else he saw. His wanting only made him want more. Soon it was countries, and then it was trade. The wanting infected the earth. We lost track of the purpose and reason for life. We began to forget our songs. We forgot our stories. We could no longer see or hear our ancestors or talk with each other across the kitchen table. Forests were being mowed down all over the world, and Rabbit had no place to play. Rabbit's trick had backfired. Rabbit tried to call the clay man back, but when the clay man wouldn't listen, Rabbit realized he'd made a clay man with no ears. Do you want to speak to this amazing poem? Woo.
Incredible poem.
Yes.
It's a didactic poem, as you can hear. It uses the traditional figure of Rabbit out of Native American folklore. There's also in other tribes, the character of Coyote is something like that. Rabbit and Coyote are kind of trickster figures who mostly do small tricks and pull. They're like the Yiddish Dybbuk or something. They pull a lot of tricks on you, and they do a lot of stuff. And I like the way at the beginning it's kind of funny. She's like, we were like listening to the gossip about Rabbit and what Rabbit was doing. In some poems, like say Hart Crane, the language races ahead of the thought. But here, the language is pretty contained as it goes through this parable. But the parable is a pretty clear one, I think, about what happens when Rabbit, out of a kind of trick, as an indigenous person, makes a clay man. And this is the story of the golem. This is like you take this clay figure and you breathe life into it, and the life here is the white man. And the clay man is you made a clay man who you say, you teach him how to steal, and then he steals, and then you try and control him, but you can't control him anymore. Because first he just wants your wife, then he wants someone else's wife, then he wants all the wives, then he wants all the gold, then he wants all the land. And poor Rabbit has like created something that he can't control any longer. There's an incredibly personal moment in this poem, which I know about. I know it's so personal because she says we, but also Joy Harjo's written 2 memoirs, and in both memoirs she writes about this. Sitting at the kitchen table, we lost all the stories. We couldn't, I think there's a moment there, right, where she says, I couldn't remember the stories.
And the songs,
We couldn't
too.
remember the songs. This is about being displaced. This is about being dislocated. You're cut off from your roots. Rabbit is like no longer king, but it's not just Rabbit, it's us, right? Do you remember the lines? Do you have the lines?
Yeah, we began to forget our songs. We forgot our stories. We could no longer see or hear our ancestors or talk with each other across the kitchen table.
So this is all about loss. This is all about what happens when the dominant culture takes over and you're no longer in touch with your own stories, your own people. Immigrants have this all the time. This is a particularly indigenous story here. But then I think she hit upon this idea of, which is just brutal, the clay man had no ears. It's just, and of course the clay man can't hear. So, you can see why I wanted to end the book with this poem, because I've argued that these indigenous stories were also at the root of American poetry. But I wanted to end, so I ended, the penultimate piece is about Garrett Hongo and his poem Ancestral Graves, and about going back to the graveyard and losing the stories of his relatives from Japan and Hawaii, and the lost to going to a deserted graveyard where it's just been abandoned. There are no mourners anymore. The stories have all been forgotten. And he tries to tell the story. And then this poem, which is personal, but really is more didactic and a kind of parable. But it's a parable about a brutal parable about American culture and holding us responsible.
It does so much work in the span of that poem. And like you said, when we alight on that last line, it's brutal. You can feel it in your body as you're reading it.
We're going to run out of time, but can we say something about Julia de Burgos?
Let's do it.
Okay.
Absolutely, please do.
Yeah. Do you want to say something about her?
No, I would love to hear you say something about it.
So, aside from people who've already read my book, how many people here have heard of a poet named Julia de Burgos? So this is a point. I mean, this is a somewhat literary, I'm going to flatter you, somewhat literary. I'm going to pretend you're literary. This is a somewhat literary group. Everyone here has heard of Emily Dickinson and Walt Whitman and Herman Melville, and probably Joy Harjo, and maybe even Adrienne Rich and Muriel Rukeyser, but almost none of our experts, let alone general readers, have heard about Julia de Burgos. The reason they haven't heard about her is that she is a Puerto Rican independentista who wrote in Spanish. She spent most of her life in New York. She lived in the Bronx. Once you know about her, she starts popping up. Like, for example, there is a postage stamp with Julia de Burgos' name on it. There is a Julia de Burgos Cultural Center up in the Bronx. There is a Julia de Burgos School in the Bronx. There are Julia de Burgos schools all over the United States, because she's a tremendously important person in Puerto Rican community as a cultural activist. She's way ahead of the Neo-Rican Cafe. But because she wrote in Spanish, no one thinks of her as part of the canon of American poetry. But I mean, if you remember American history, by the Jones Act, the United States, made Puerto Rico part of the United States, basically so that we could conscript soldiers for the war effort. But we then made Puerto Rico part of the United States. So therefore, although Puerto Rico may want to be independent and there's a literary tradition of Puerto Rico itself, I make the case, well, then Puerto Rican poetry is also part of the United States poetry, because we've made people citizens. We've colonized this place. So the fact that Julia de Burgos loved Garcia Lorca and lived in the Bronx and wrote in Spanish doesn't mean that she's not part of American poetry. And actually, if I had more space, I would have done the same thing for all kinds of poets. In 100 Poems to Break Your Heart, I make the case for Kaja Molodowski, who was a Yiddish poet who lived in New York and wrote in Yiddish. No one thinks of her as an American poet either because she wrote in Yiddish. But there she was, spent most of her adult life living in New York, writing in Yiddish. So people think of her in terms of Yiddish poetry, but there she was, an American citizen responding. And so it goes. We just have a narrow idea about America and about American poetry. And I go, well, I don't want to just let anyone in. I'm not going to say that Robert Desnos, one of my favorite French poets, is an American poet. He's not. I don't want to say that Paul Eluard is. I don't want to say that Garcia Lorca is. He came to the United States, but he's not an American poet. He's a Spanish poet. But Julia de Burgos, she's a Puerto Rican independista. She's an American poet. And so I'm sort of making the case for saying, well, let's expand the canon. And I'm very proud of this particular piece because our literary experts have not heard of her because it's a prescribed idea of what the American canon is. But when you just start thinking about what is America and who's in America, then you won't be surprised. Every community in America has its poets. And so they represent. And so she just adds something to me. She adds something tremendous to the chorus because she brings in a whole other reading list. She brings in a whole other political conversation. She just brings in all kinds of things. And the introduction to the Julia de Burgos chapter is, to me, the weirdest thing that I wrote personally in the whole book, because I imagine. Julia de Burgos loved Garcia Lorca. She's just hugely influenced by Lorca. And Lorca came to the United States in 1929, 1930, and he wrote a tremendous book called Poeta en Nueva York. And Julia de Burgos lived in the 1950s in the Bronx. And so I imagine, in the beginning of my chapter, that I take a walk, because I was living on the Upper West Side, and I was living and teaching in poets in the schools in the late 70s. I imagine going to Columbia and picking up Garcia Lorca on a walk, but we can't converse because he only pretended that he knew English. He told his parents he was learning English, but he really didn't know any English. But we walk up, but Julia de Burgos knew Spanish and English, so I imagine that Lorca and I are going to take a walk to go see Julia de Burgos in the Bronx. And so, of course, these are like three just totally different time periods, 1929, 1956, 1973. And then my dream dissolves, but I say, it would be nice to imagine that there's a metaphysical corner where time gets lost and three poets from different eras can talk to each other.
Contemporaneously, yeah.
And it takes this idea of Ezra Pound's that all poets are contemporaneous, which I believe in some way. So I think it's the weirdest of the introductions, but I'm very proud of it. And I was insistent, though everyone at the Library of America thought, no, it's just, this is not nonfiction.
I love that. And the de Burgos poem is really wonderful. There's also a memorial at Poets House for the victims of Hurricane Maria, right?
It's outside Poets House.
Yeah,
in
outside
a park.
Poets House.
Do you want to end with that poem?
Yeah, let's do it. And then I'll hand it back to you, Danielle, for questions from the audience. So this is one of two poems she wrote in English towards the end of her life.
Near the very end of her life, she wrote two poems in English, and I'm writing about one of them when she was on what now is Governor's Island, right?
Yeah, in Goldwater Memorial Hospital,
where
NYU also had like a poetry program that I used to teach in. Farewell in Welfare Island. It has to be from here, right this instance, my cry into the world. Life was somewhere forgotten and sought refuge in depths of tears and sorrows over this vast empire of solitude and darkness. Where is the voice of freedom? Freedom to laugh, to move without the heavy phantom of despair. Where is the form of beauty, unshaken in its veil, simple and pure? Where is the warmth of heaven, pouring its dreams of love in broken spirits? It has to be from here, right this instance, my cry into the world. My cry that is no more mine, but hers and his forever. The comrades of my silence, the phantoms of my grave. It has to be from here, forgotten but unshaken, among comrades of silence, deep into Welfare Island, my farewell to the world. Woo! Julia de Burgos. Woo!
But first I want to open the floor for some questions. Down in the front row.
I'm just curious. I'm not so well versed in poetry, but I love music and pop music and the poetry of rock and roll and music itself, but and also rap music. My son is a big lover of rap music, and so I'm wondering, how does the American songbook and writers of song play into your idea of poetry?
It's its own tradition, which is certainly part of poetry, but it's not exactly the same thing. And I'd say that there are different sources in American culture, and one of them is this tremendous oral river of oral poetry, which is performed and which is only alive when it's performed. It's best when it's performed as opposed to being read. It's not that it doesn't work at all, but I personally, I'm a huge fan of Bob Dylan, but I like to hear him sing, actually. I don't like to read. I know there a lot of people make the case for it on the page. I don't believe it works that well on the page. Same thing with Leonard Cohen. I'm a huge fan of Leonard Cohen. You just read it as poetry. To me, it's not quite convincing. But that doesn't mean I don't think it's great. I just think it's part of a slightly different tradition related to music and using lyrics. And the American Songbook is, in my opinion, like that. It's in this space between music and poetry. Now, there are cultures where there's African tribes. Historically, there's no single word for poetry that's different than song. Poetry and song are exactly the same thing in many cultures. But starting in England, when Gutenberg invented the printing press, it became possible not just to hear poems, but also to read them. And I believe that when you read a poem, you're doing something different than when you're hearing it sung to you or recited to you. So I in no way want to discount this tradition. I think it's a tremendous tradition, but it's a completely oral tradition, in my opinion. And it loses something when it loses its voice. And poetry, when you recite an Emily Dickinson poem, that's a little different than when you're like singing along to Beyonce. And you become the vehicle for the Emily Dickinson poem in a way that's different than when you're listening to rap and reciting along with, saying 8 Mile Road or whatever you happen to like. So I think the rhyming is tremendous. The wordplay is lively, and it's an important pop art form. And it's tremendously successful. But I also think that we also need some advocacy for Amy Lowell, because rap is just so tremendously successful in the culture. I mean, you're talking about your son, but tell me a young person who isn't influenced by this. That it's everywhere in the culture. It's related to poetry. It's got tremendous amount of wordplay. It comes out of personal experience. It's a very important art form, but it's slightly different in some kind of contingent or adjacent relationship to the poems in this book.
Yes.
Your eloquent comment makes me think about the issue of poetry and education. I was very lucky to grow up in a family where I read poetry every night before I went to sleep. And so I grew up loving poetry. But what about poetry in the school system? It's seen as something so arcane and archaic and arty and highfalutin. Why is it not an essential part of our education, like math and learning grammar or something? Because I think we're never going to fully own our poetic tradition without it being integrated into education. So I wonder what we think of this issue.
Well, first of all, what you're describing is of what you grew up with is why people love poetry from other countries, why people who grew up in other countries have or used to, at least in any case, have a different feeling about poetry than most Americans do. Because if you were of a certain age and you were in Russia, you learned about Pushkin, but not just in school. You learned about it from your parents who cared about it. And you heard them recite Lermontov, and so it meant something to them, and therefore it meant something to you. Most people don't have in America what you had. And so school has to step in to do the work that families are not doing.
But it doesn't.
Exactly, but it doesn't. Now, what are the causes of this and how can we rectify it? I believe the cause probably has something to do with the Puritan origins of the American educational system, in which art was considered marginal, not practical. And the pragmatist mentality that defined American education through Puritanism, because the Puritans were extremely skeptical of all art, led to a kind of way of thinking about poetry. Now, in the 19th century, there were a group of poets called the Fireside Poets, Longfellow, Whittier, James Russell Lowell, who were immensely popular. They were also called the schoolroom poets. And these poets were they were, in my opinion, somewhat sentimental, but they were reassuring at a time when the country was not a very reassuring place. And people took them into the hearth. That's where they're called the Fireside Poets. Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot and Wallace Stevens and all the great modernists wanted to rescue American poetry from that tradition. And they did. But at the same time, it's sort of the equivalent in jazz of turning your back to the audience. They turned their back to the audience. They made poetry difficult. They said because of their basic contempt of the middle class, because of their authoritarian and anti-democratic feelings, they didn't say this is difficult poetry that you can understand. They said this is difficult poetry that's contemptuous of you. And then poetry started to become an elite activity. And as soon as it became an elite activity, there became a clerisy of people, the new critics, who could understand it, and the rest of us schmucks who couldn't understand it at all. Mm-hmm. And then the teachers that began to teach it in this way. Now, I believe that the program that Kenneth Koch initiated of Poets in the Schools tries to counter this in some kind of crucial way. I came up in this system. That was my first poetry job, was teaching poetry writing to kids. And I think that helps, because even though it's emphasizing their creativity, not their reading of poetry, it nonetheless initiates them into poetry and the idea that poetry is a living thing. There are people standing in front of them who write this stuff, who care about it, and bring it to them. But it's just a one-time experience. It's not carried over. And so, there are a lot of organizations, the Academy of American Poets, Poets House, Poetry Society of America, the Library of Congress, have try to do a lot of work to help reform the curriculum and bring this into American education. But you're going against a tremendous cultural force. And the cultural force is getting stronger, in my opinion, against us because of the tremendous way that education is turned towards pragmatism. Mm-hmm. The idea that college or university should be job training is just against the liberal arts education idea. And the idea that, because poetry contributes to your larger education and the schooling of your heart. It's not going to hurt you from getting a job, but it's not about that. It's about something else. It's a kind of non-utilitarian knowledge. And so basically we need to make the case, which we have not done very well as American poets and as advocates for poetry, on why poetry actually matters educationally, but also personally. And I've done a lot of work to try and do this, to try and cross this divide, to try and make up for what's happening in the schools, which is turning people off to poetry. But there's a large force at work here, which we're trying to counter.
Question over here.
So I just want to say that I grew up in the Bronx, and many decades ago, in some high school classes, I was introduced to some wonderful poetry. in bare ruin choirs. From that to curiosity and lots of things in between. And I didn't believe that it was a unique experience in the city school system. Maybe it was, but it was a wonderful experience. So I just want to say that there was a time when in a typical English class in a high school in the New York City school system, specific beautiful poetry was.
My guess would, I appreciate your point. My guess is that you had a teacher and that what you thought was widespread was maybe not. I'm not saying it wasn't, but I mean, there have always been teachers. And there have always been teachers who cared about poetry. And so across the country, I encounter people that have your experience. But it's not the majority experience. But it's because you had a teacher or teachers who cared and brought it into the curriculum and gave you a feeling for it. It's not as if we're not all exposed to poetry. I mean, most of us took some kind of freshman class, required English class in college. That just most of the people that go through just don't become readers of poetry. They just don't become initiated because they don't see why it's important, but they've been exposed to it. But the reason that I think I don't know your experience, and I believe you totally, it's clearly the case. But it might be because you had a teacher who really cared about it and therefore taught it to you in such a way that you understood that this was something meaningful and that Shakespeare wasn't just something that was some academic thing that you were supposed to learn by rote, but that there's a voice here saying these things and these things are meaningful. That would be my guess, because there have always been teachers.
Yeah, from my experience, I didn't expect that it was only for us. I thought that it was ubiquitous. So
yeah, good luck
I
with that.
believe
I like your idea. I'm going with you. That's how it was.
at least at that point in time.
Yeah.
But he was one English teacher, I'm thinking.
Yeah, that's my guess. That's my guess. I'll just say I didn't have that English teacher.
So thank you so much, the two of you, because you enacted something that we need desperately. I will never forget the refrigerator poem story. And Edward, I'm thinking just of how you transformed yourself as you were talking about individual poems. It was a performance. It was like a dance performance. You leaned forward. You were embodying a kind of, it's not just enthusiasm, but it was really a possession. You showed us that you're possessed by these works. And I'm just wondering how, I mean, is this learned? Is this innate? Is this what you do?
How do we get this?
I can't answer your question except to say that when I was younger, when I was younger, I was just writing my poems. But when I decided that I wanted to try and make the case for what I cared about out of my teaching, I resolved that I would always be emotionally present when I talked about poetry. And I don't know about the possession part and what you're saying, but I do try to be present to what I'm talking about, and because I care about it. And I believe that you're enacting that care and your passion for it. And because it's different, maybe I was more emphasized this way because of the way that people would traditionally talk about poetry. As if it's some kind of academic subject based on the board, and that's just not my experience. And it's not the experience that most poets have. People don't start writing poetry for that reason. They usually start writing poetry out of some hurt. They move to it because something has happened to them that they can't process. And then if they go on to become, almost everyone writes poetry this way in adolescence. You go on to become a poet because you find that this way of being in the world as a way to console yourself. It's a way to try and make sense of things. And you find that not only does it make sense for you by writing it, but it makes sense because you find other people's poems that matter to you. And you wish you had written those poems. Mm-hmm. And those poems speak to you so personally. And what I found is that poets are not often very articulate or necessarily articulate about their own poems or about other people's poems. And they are good teachers. I had a lot of them, but they were really academic. And I met a lot of smart people at college who could really talk about poetry, but it was the way you talk about certain kinds of formulas. And I decided that the poetry that I was reading, the poetry of Garcia Lorca, the poetry of Pablo Neruda, the poetry of the Hungarian poet Miklos Radnati, the Russian poets Mandelstam and Akhmatova and Svetaeva and Pasternak, the Turkish poet Nazım Hikmet, these were life and death matters. These were not just sort of academic, let's discover the well-wrought urn. And think about irony and ambiguity in poetry. There's like lots at stake in these poems. And so when I read Cesar Vallejo, when I read these poets from other countries, and I began to feel like this is what I want to be part of, this tradition, then you should talk about poetry that way because that's what it means to you. And then I think what I would say is that many people are embarrassed because passion is embarrassing, and it's better to be protected, and it's better to be cynical than in a sense of wonder. Wonder exposes you. But I just decided, too bad. I'm going forward. But I think it's because I'm unconscious of this when I'm doing it. But the idea is that I would always be present, talking about the poems that means something to me so that you get something of my passion for it. It's not hard because if you just listen to we started with that Amy Lowell poem.
Yeah.
It's like, you just have to, how can you think that, I don't see how you could have a traditional opinion academic opinion about Amy Lowell when you read that poem, when you just open yourself up to what it is. Or the De Burgos poem, which is a farewell to life. It's a goodbye poem and it's my cry into the world. So I just want to try and honor those voices and what they've meant to me and what I think they mean in terms of a human conversation. And in my opinion, if people talked about poetry in this way, then you might not love poetry, but you're not going to say it doesn't matter. Because it clearly, in the way I read these poems really matter. People are really speaking from their heart. They're really trying to tell you something. In the Amy Lowell poem, it's a love poem of extraordinary passion. In the De Burgos poem, it's a farewell to life. It's a death poem. It's a self-elegy, my cry into the world.
Well, the Library of America bio describes Edward Hirsch as a tireless advocate for poetry, and we've seen that here. And where do the new poets of the world come to light? In literary magazines.
That's right.
Nicely done. Nicely done.